In the current presentation, I'll focus on the general principles of dialogic education. So first, let us recall the general definition of dialogue and the general definition of dialogic education. So generally, a dialogue is basically a communication through the use of language. Generally, this communication takes place between two or more people. Dialogic education, therefore, is an approach to education that places dialogue at the center of the educational process. So generally, dialogic education, the emphasis of dialogic education is on open and inclusive communication, critical thinking, and the participation on the part of the teacher and student in the process of education. The aim of this is to actually foster meaningful learning experiences for the students. And so generally, dialogic education has certain important principles that we will briefly discuss in this presentation. So here are some important principles of the dialogic education. So the first one is that knowledge is a product of a co-construction. The general philosophy of education, or the general practice of education, or the general understanding related to the traditional method of education is that education is, or actually knowledge is something that is transferred from the authority, that is the teacher or the curriculum developers, to the students. And so the role of the student is actually to accumulate and to get that knowledge. But in the dialogic concept of education, the aim of the focus of education is the co-construction of knowledge rather than the transfer of knowledge. So this is a very important, and you can say a radical principle of the dialogic education, where the students or the taught are not considered as empty boxes to be filled with information, but as someone who can actually take part and take productive part in the process of not just accumulation, but the construction of knowledge. Secondly, because of this main principle, the second important principle is that education is something that happens through collaboration between the teacher and the taught, and among the taught or among the students. So collaboration in terms of the development of knowledge, in terms of the shaping of knowledge, or in terms of the transformation of knowledge, is something that is a very important principle of dialogic education. Thirdly, and importantly, it is important in dialogic education that the process of critical reflection on the aims of education, the processes of education, and the outcomes of education is very important. So it is extremely important on the part of both the planners, the curriculum developers, the teachers, and the students to continuously and critically reflect on the aims of education, the processes of education, the outcomes of education, and the material that is involved in the process of education. So critical independent thinking is extremely important in dialogic education. The next one is that the principle of inclusion and diversity, or you can say the democratization of the process of education. So as we know that in dialogic education, it is not like a top-down structure, but there is a horizontal level of relationship among the various stakeholders of education, the teachers, the students, the curriculum developers, the policy makers, and So therefore, inclusion, democracy, diversity of views and opinions, and the idea that knowledge has several sources and there are different ways of the transfer of knowledge as well. Keeping in view these, democracy and inclusion and diversity is another center around which the principles of dialogic education revolved. Lastly, flexibility in terms of aims, means, and outcomes of education. So as we know that generally the traditional concept of education is that there are fixed aims, there are fixed means, and there are fixed outcomes around which the concept of education or the process of education revolves. But in the dialogic concept of education, there is flexibility in terms of the aims of education, and so that actually means that the aims of education will evolve over a period of time. The means of education, for example, the teaching methods that teachers use or the implementation of the curriculum. So there is flexibility in terms of that, and also in terms of the outcomes, keeping in view the particular situations, the particular circumstances, the particular abilities of the students. There is also flexibility in terms of the outcomes of education. So these are the main principles around which the idea or the concept of dialogic education revolves.